welcome to the transport seminar at McGill. It is a pleasure and honor, and I'm so happy to have Professor Deb Niemeier with us. She's the A. James Clark School of Engineering at the University of Maryland. She's the distinguished chair there. Her achievements are like a lot. And if I sat down to read her resume online, it will take me the entire seminar to finish it. This is how distinguished she is and how prestigious it is. And she's a very nice human being. Let's put all that to the side.
That's the most important thing.
That's the most important part that I really like about Deb, and that's why we invited her. And to tell you how nice she is, she's here with us during Thanksgiving, and she's taking 1 hour of her time to talk to you guys. And she wanted to have it a little bit more interactive today with the students. So, Deb, then mute everybody when you start sharing your screen again.
Okay, so here's what I want to take just like 3 seconds, and I have you all up on my screen. So you can't get away with hiding behind no video. I know who you are. Up here they come. Okay, so here's what I want to know from you. I want to know, like in a short bullet point, what your big takeaway from the last 12 weeks is. So like just to unmute, kind of filter in, but tell me, what's your big takeaway from the last 12 weeks? Claire, you go first. I see you and you have a look of like, I've got a takeaway.
I guess first thing that comes to my mind is that equity is not something that's easy to achieve, and it's not something that is defined universally by a lot of people, and the different contexts that you see it in, it has different meaning, and I don't think it's that easy to achieve, and I think it takes hard work, and I think it takes a lot of listening to really achieve equity in transportation.
Okay. Anybody else want to pop in?
I'm kind of responding to a similar thing, but just how much of an uphill battle equity is, since inequity tends to reproduce itself. I mean, one of the problems with inequality is that it produces
the poverty cycle, right?
It's a cycle. There's all these feedbacks into inequality. That to break that cycle, it requires a lot of hard work and pretty radical interventions.
Great, thank you. Others?
Just building off of Claire's point, the goals that we pursue depend on how we define equity.
Nicely said. Others?
Also building on that, a theme that has come up a lot is that it's very difficult to measure equity, and the ideas of how best to measure whether we have achieved it vary a lot. There's a lot of, a theme that came up a lot was the need for more qualitative approaches, because so much has been focused on people who are doing desk research, when what we really need is people who are also going out in the field.
In the community, sure. That's nice. Good. Any others want to hop in?
No one individual person's understanding of equity, like in and of itself, will be sufficient, because we've had so much of these last 12 weeks have been gathering like all these perspectives from people with disabilities, from people who just understand equity differently because of what their lived experiences, and
that's
just
that's really a great comment. Others?
I guess sort of building on that, like the aim, like how you define equity and whose perspectives you're taking into account might in fact be like pursuing conflicting aims. Like if you're, having disability activism really inform it, then there might be more cars in the planning than if you're having like other types that would be more like anti-car, then that really impacts how you end up like planning for transport.
Yeah. I think Chris from Uber talks about that a lot. Anyone else want to chime in real quick?
Like a common theme that kept coming up was how to empower everybody to participate and to like really give everybody a voice, especially like the marginalized, because again, like a bunch of people have already mentioned, equity is like perceived differently, different people experience it differently. So it's important for us to include everybody into like decision making and the planning process, and just to get different perspectives. And I guess the planner's role is to just really tie everything in.
Yeah, that's nice. I like that. Anyone else?
Just how political it is. Like, you got to be constantly fighting to get this to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a funny thing. And, when you think about this stuff, that such huge disparities in wealth would be political. You just can't, most of us have a hard time wrapping our head around that. Yes. So that's a good question. I mean, good comment. Anyone else want to take a shot, and then I'll start talking a little bit? You just want to get your videos off, I know. All right, let me talk. Thank you for sharing that with me. Should I go ahead and go screen share?
Yeah.
All right. So I think now you should see my screen. Everybody see my screen okay? Yeah, okay, great. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to do something a little bit heretical, in the sense that I've taken some time and I've gone through and listened to all the talks, and I know most people who spoke personally. So in some ways it's going to be pretty funny to sort of say all this stuff. First I want to say thank you. It's really nice to be here, even though this is a holiday. This particular holiday is come to stand for me for food, for family, and being grateful. So I just want to say to everyone, I'm grateful for the opportunity to spend this hour and celebrate sort of Thanksgiving, talking about something that's incredibly important to me with you. The other thing I want to say is, like, I was at McGill for a lecture many years ago. I don't know how long it's been, but it's been a long while. And I started with a personal story about my mom's ability to get a loan for a house from a neighborhood banker. She was a female head of household at the time. She had 4 young children, not a lot of prospects for job at that moment, but she was still able to get a loan from this bank. And something, there was an interesting intersection of identity with that loan. She partially got that loan because she was white and in a fairly affluent community, but because she was female, she had to have a co-signer at the time. So it was this weird sort of gender race kind of intersection that I've thought a lot about over the time, because it really saved my mom at the time. And so where I've turned to as an academic is spending more time to sort of thinking about this intersection of identity and community and equity and sort of climate change as a pressing question, and the urban environment. And so I'm going to focus a lot on the urban environment. That's not to say questions don't arise in the rural environment, they do, but my interest largely lies, and expertise largely lies, in the urban environment. So for the first few slides, I'm going to run through some examples of what I heard and what I didn't hear, which is almost as important as what you did hear. Now, when I do this, I want you to keep in mind 3 things, or 4 things actually, okay? I have the benefit of hindsight. I can go back and listen to these talks and say, oh, you missed this or you missed that, right? Like, you guys will be able to do that for my talk when I'm done today. And then the other thing is that talks in general represent just sort of a snapshot, just a moment in time of what a person might be thinking. And so sometimes you can miss sort of the multi-dimensionality of what is actually sort of on their plate, of, their intellectual plate. And then, I might also not be a good translator. In my head, I might have heard words and shifted them around and then rephrased them, and what comes out is not really what they meant. So, and then finally, the other thing I want you all to know when I'm doing this is I'm fairly irreverent. And part of what academic growth is for me is to both play with and poke at our scholarship. So you're going to hear a lot of sort of irreverence in all of this. Okay, so now let me start. And the slides are not in any any particular order. I sort of just pulled them through, and let's go to the first one. Okay, and I'm not going to go through and name who said what. I'm going to assume you can figure it out. So in one talk I heard, since the 1980s, greater disparity, you know, the middle class is becoming poor. This is important as it relates to urban well-being and justice. Significantly, what I didn't hear was we, the collective us, who we're all talking about, screwed up. We screwed up with our norms, with our processes, with the values that we brought into the built environment. And as a result, we're in a big mess. Change is very hard. And we've got big problems, but we're going to leave it to the future generation because, hey, we're fine as an individual, right? So I didn't hear any of this sort of acknowledgement of how we got here, which I think is really important to go forward. You gotta take ownership. And I've highlighted two phrases here: structure of inequality and climate change, because these are what I believe are the single most defining issues at this moment in history. And you're going to see me return to these over and over and over. Okay, so here's another one. Give poor people cars and everything will be fixed, more or less. Okay, here's what I didn't hear. Hey, how about climate change, right? We're going to give all these poor people, poor households cars. But what about climate change? And those EVs where the subsidies are out, you know, who's going to pay to get all these cars into EVs? Oh, and why do poor people have to share cars, but the rich get 4 or 5? And oh, and what about the long distances the poor households are now driving to get into cities for jobs? I have a paper just out in Transport Geography where we show that, you know, the urban poor have moved outward to suburbs now and are less served by transit, you know? So who pays the cost of owning the auto? Next one, what I didn't hear, there are new and improved mobility options for the disabled. Now I know Chris really well, you know, I like him a lot. We've been on committees together. Here's what I didn't hear. Why doesn't Uber pay a living wage, right? Provide benefits for its workers, right? So, you know, I think we'll go through these. How about this? We need to think about what it means to have a just sustainability. We need to reckon with, and I love this phrase, I had not heard it before, the relationship between belonging and becoming in cities. I mean, I just thought that was just so beautiful. But here's what I imagine, you know, he's thinking. Why are you rich, well-educated, technology-driven, and so forth people talking about smart cities, right? Like there's this whole thing, you know, he's talking about just sustainable cities and wondering why everyone else is talking about smart cities, right? Here's another one, co-production of knowledge and results. You know, I think this is very, very, very important. But again, I'm like, got to acknowledge. And what you didn't hear was, wow, for years it didn't even occur to us we should be solving the problems the community wanted us to solve, right? So we're at a good point where people are earnest and well-meaning and engaged and still one step away from saying, look, we've totally messed this up and we're in a very hard position. And actually, I heard that a lot from you guys. Like you're looking at, I shouldn't say you guys anymore, from you all, and you're looking at everything and you're saying, wow, how do we change this? We're in a very hard spot right now. And so what I'm doing is I'm poking fun at these subtexts, or not even poking fun, just highlighting some of the subtexts because they matter. They matter because most of us, including me, have often approach our problems, particularly in transportation, I will add, with a very limited dimensioning of the problem we're working on. And we can't actually solve this issue of limited dimensioning by working alone or only working with others that look or trained like us. And for issues of structural inequality, we have to talk about how we have baked in inequalities to our built environment in nearly every urban city in the world. And for climate change, the changes that need to occur are going to be so much bigger than one field can contribute. You look at this in the energy field, where we're trying to figure out how to go from centralized energy to decentralized energy, and energy poverty occurs, and engineers don't understand why people don't want their house wired to the hilt with internet of everything. And engineers are like, this will optimize these micro distributional sort of decentralized energy systems, but we have to have IoT and nobody wants it. What's the problem, right? Like, are you people just stupid, right? And this is the kind of conversation I hear all the time. And social scientists will come in. There's a really great person, Yael Pareg in Israel, who does a lot of work on energy poverty. She comes in and she says, she does these surveys about why people don't want their houses wired, right? Why they don't want the IoT. But engineers don't talk to her, right? Like, they don't reach out and talk to her. So, and I think planners are a little bit, like engineers. They tend to work within urban planning and with other planners. And so, so that's what I'm gonna talk about today, is like, how do you get your blinders off, and how do you sort of think about problems in this multi-dimensional way that all of us do, but how do you like reinforce and push back at this multi-dimensional? And to do this, I'm going to give you an example of where I totally failed to understand a problem until somebody who happened to be a historian pushed me to look a lot deeper. And so I think it'll be an interesting story for you. And it's one of my own failures. And it led to a new way for me to do mental mapping, if you want to use that word, about how I approach research problems. And I'll show you that sort of near the end. So let's go through this, and I'm sure some of you will remember this. The fire in Paradise, California in 2018 was the largest fire California had ever experienced. And the smoke went all the way across the states, up through New York, and hit parts of Canada. I can't remember where, but you guys had some of the smoke from that fire come across. And at the time I'm still doing some evacuation research, disaster evacuation research. And one of the problems in the disaster evacuation literature is we don't get information about the evacuation for anywhere from 3 to 6 to 5 years post-disaster. And so I needed a way, I saw this as a way to refine our understanding of sort of the decisions and psychological trade-offs people make in evacuation. So we were my research group was the only group that was allowed to go into the Red Cross shelters immediately after the Paradise fire. And over the month that followed the fire, we collected hundreds and hundreds of firsthand accounts of how people evacuated, the decision trade-offs they made, what they left behind. And then since the fire, we've been following a lot of these households. And, when I was doing it, I was thinking, wow, I'm really going to be able to talk about how people do decision-making in the evacuation disaster experience. And we're analyzing data now, and there's some papers that are on their way out, but we can already see these big patterns of failure. And I'm not going to talk about these today because what I really want to get to you is talk to you about how my limited dimensionality about getting close to event evacuation information almost stopped me from understanding a bigger and perhaps more important picture about disaster evacuation. Okay, so some of you probably have seen these. They were in the news for like the year after the fire. The fire began at a PG&E electric gas tower, and you can see it up there in the right-hand side. When a part separated from the main arm of the tower, and it basically blew off the tower, and it landed on ground that was really dry. We had been in a drought for a very, very long time. And around 6:30, 7 o'clock that morning of the fire, one of the utility employees saw it near the tower, but wasn't really that worried because the winds were not as bad as they had been forecasted. But what happened was the winds were just sufficient enough to start the fire and drive it down the valley. And it went really fast down the valley. And you can see once it hit Paradise, there was what we call structure to structure ignition. And the fire caught, once it caught fire on one building, it caught fire on another. It blew embers to another building, and that building caught fire. So it spread really fast. And in fact, some of the post-fire audits have suggested that the fire, sorry, spread at the rate of like 60 to 80 football fields every minute. So it was an incredibly fast fire. And when the fire, went roaring through, these health alerts went into effect, and they stayed in effect for, I don't know, many weeks, like 6 or 7 weeks. And like in Davis, where I was at that time, it was so bad you couldn't go outside, and people were changing their air conditioning, your, what do you call that thing, your filters, like every 2 weeks, and it would be caked with soot. And so here you can see where the air quality PM levels posted extremely high, and how they changed over sort of the time of the fire. And then this was a picture that I took off the Bay Bridge, and you can see how smoky it is all down in San Francisco at the time. And everyone was wearing masks. And so it was a big fire, and it had a lot of externalities in terms of air quality effects. It wasn't the biggest in terms of acreage, and here I'll give you sort of the fires, but up until this year, it was by far the most destructive. And in Paradise, where that red sort of area is, it leveled the town, and it destroyed about 19,000 structures in total. It killed around 90 to 100 people. And if you look at how it leveled the fire on this slide, just to sort of give you a sense of the damage, black means there's no damage, red means it's just not there anymore, and the yellow were places where they hadn't quite done the inspection. So you can see that where there was a town, there is no more at the culmination of this fire. Now, remember, I'm into this game because I'm interested in the evacuation issues, right? And so in Paradise, they had an evacuation plan. And in fact, they had practiced it. They had redundant communication strategies all over the city. It was going to be easy to study. There were 4 roads out of the city. A couple of these roads were kind of windy, but it didn't matter. The town had a plan. It was divided up into like 8 or 9 zones, and each zone was going to get an alert, and they were going to move people out. So this was going to be a really interesting, potentially generalizable sort of decision-making framework to study evacuation. All right. So what happened was the sheriff's office deployed the evacuation plan when the Camp Fire reached that sort of eastern edge of the city that you see. And the 6 top zones around the top where the circle is, they were ordered to clear out. Remember, the fire starts around 6:30 or 7 o'clock. They were ordered to leave by 8 o'clock. And then at the same time, though, these winds were coming down, and there's pictures of embers that are the size of dinner plates that are just flipping through structures, lighting them up. And within an hour, the sheriff's office had done a code red, and the entire city was evacuated. And so basically what happened here in this scenario was not one that anyone thought feasible. The fire burned across all 4 roads at nearly the same time. And that was due to the high winds, which are of course connected to the climate change. So here was a case where we had a lot more intense disaster than anyone predicted, and well-established evacuation plan, but the fire just moved too fast. So when I was up there, you can see like people just began abandoning their cars. And what this did was this then complicated the rescue and evacuation. And so we heard lots of stories in our interviews about people weaving through town. They were part of the early zone evacuation, but they're leaving through town and eventually having leave their car because their car is melting while they're driving. But they can't get out because the fires jumped all 4 roads. And so here you can see where people just left cars all along the roads. And then just to give you an example, I was up there about maybe 3 weeks after the fire sort of shut down. And here's the picture. On one side, you can see what the car looked like. And this was an abandoned vehicle. And on the other side, where the fire was so intense, it just melted half the vehicle. So this was a very significant hot fire. The general consensus, and you can see how this fire spread, was that even though they had this great evacuation plan and they had practiced it and they executed the first departure sign at the right time, told the 6 zones to leave, the basic consensus at the end was the fire was just too fast and it was too hot to ever fully evacuate safely. And this idea that we might not ever be able to create an evacuation plan for a place like Paradise made me start thinking about, like, what about the urban design? What would have intersected with it at that point? And here you can see that, up in Paradise, there were these sort of standard subdivision layouts. Streets weren't gridded. There were cul-de-sacs. There was one street in, one street out of these suburban areas. And if you think about it, that's a very standard design still today in like so many cities. And once the fire got into these subdivisions, and you can really see it here, once the embers entered in, the structure to structure ignition was just almost impossible to stop. And there were the fire, what they call the fire proofing or hardscaping concepts are not here. You would have multiple entryways, exit ways to get out of subdivisions. You would have structures that were further apart. You would have green areas where you could put up fire breaks. There's all kinds of things you could do, and none of this existed in these subdivisions. And then the other thing happened was there were about 30 different mobile home parks located in the area. And here I've sort of tagged a few of them. And the fire at the end of the day leveled about 20 of them. And the mobile home parks were mostly occupied by seniors on fixed incomes. And so about this time, I was talking to a friend in history, a history prof, and I was mentioning all these issues about the urban planning and the engineering design and who was really impacted in these mobile homes. And she goes, now it makes sense. And I said, what do you mean? And she goes, well, most of the people who died were women and elderly or frail people. And so I looked at the demographics of Paradise, and in fact, nearly a quarter of the Paradise residents had a disability, and this is almost twice the state rate of disabilities. And nearly 25%, a quarter of the population, was over the age of 65. And that number goes way up if I'm willing to bring it down to 60. And if I think about 25% of the population in the city over the age of 65, this compares to 14% of the population statewide. So we have an area that was disproportionately frail, elderly, disabled, living in these subdivisions that were not sort of hardscaped against fire up on a ridge. And so what she was saying to me is how do we actually get there? How did it get to this point that these are the kinds of features that people ended up living in, who were much older and who had much greater levels of disability? And it was a really simple question. How did it get to this point? So backing away a little bit from my primary interest, which was the evacuation, right? Like, I'm going to go in, I'm going to be the first, I'm going to get all this data, straight out of people's mouths. Like a week after they've evacuated, we did all this training on trauma. We did a very, what I think of as a very good survey approach. I realized like that might not be the most important problem in this, in this sort of evacuation, this particular one. So then I started doing even more research, and I went back to the beginning, okay, the very beginning of Paradise. So the town was founded in the summer of 1860, and the lore is that summer of 1860 was really, really hot, and the guy who founded was named William Leonard, and when he came up there, he said, this must be paradise because the temperatures are cooler. And what happened was there was a sawmill built, and then suddenly there was a general store, and then Southern Pacific put a railroad depot in there. And then in the early 1900s, a brand new sawmill was put in and a new dam for electricity. And then in the mid 1950s, the main road, the big road on the left, as you looked at with those 4 roads, was paved over, and the population went from like 2,000 to 10,000. And even though everybody knew about the ridge's potential for blown fire. So by the 1960s, an interesting thing happens. People who live in Chico at the bottom of the valley start referring to Paradise as Poverty Ridge. And if a mobile home was the only dwelling you could afford, then Paradise had like just scores of open spaces under pine trees, and poor white people flocked to the ridge. And shortly after that, retirees did in huge numbers. And the town swelled from 10,000 to about 28,000. And so at this point, you're stuck in this little place between 2 canyons. And so you ask yourself, well, how does a place grow when it's stuck in between 2 canyons? And what it does is it goes higher up the narrow ridge, and it starts planting these really nice retiree communities. And the first one was an upscale retiree community called Paradise Pines. And here you can see it from a drone or a remote sensing image that I took it from years before the fire. Anyway, and the subdivider marketed it to retirees all over Southern California and San Francisco. And in the 60s and the 70s, retirees just flooded, 15,000 to 20,000 retirees. They brought their home equity to Paradise Pines, and suddenly Poverty Ridge wasn't so impoverished anymore. And the one thing all of them had in common, like I say, the rednecks, the retirees, and the hippies all agreed on one thing. No arm of the local or state government could lay a hand on their pine trees. And this is going to come back to change, to really sort of kick them. So in short, for an urban planning class, this equals no zoning. All right, so you have this city now. In the early 70s, there's a reporter that comes on board and says, basically anything goes right now. What's happening? Paradise Pine went in, it's so much bigger than we thought. And what they were doing, what this developer and a county supervisor were doing was they were doing this thing called 4x4ing. You don't see it anymore because it's not allowed, but back then you did. And a businessman bought a huge parcel in Paradise that would become Paradise Pines, and the county supervisors would immediately, and did immediately, grant his request to divide the parcel into 4 parcels, 4 pieces. And then he sold one of the pieces to another partner in this enterprise who went before the same board, same county supervisors, and won approval to divide his piece into 4. And this went on, and you can track the residential transactions through the late 60s all the way through the end of the 70s. And the number 4 is not arbitrary. If you split a parcel into 5 pieces, you suddenly qualify as a subdivision under state law, and it requires you to put in proper infrastructure and also to examine certain, sort of potential environmental disasters. And in this case, it would have been, the fire hazards. And so what happened over time was like all these housing tract subdivisions popped up. They didn't have sidewalks, gutters, they didn't have buffers to do like a defensible space against fires. Homes were spread out, but you had beautiful vistas throughout these subdivisions. And so let's go back to Paradise Pines. Remember, this is one of the first really big ones that was marketed to retirees. And here's what it looked like after the fire popped in and just wiped it out. So you can see in it, and it's closed in. There was a lot of evacuation that had to happen. People got out, but total loss. I mean, just total homeowner loss. So where does this leave us, right? Where did they end up? Well, the costs were just phenomenally huge. Munich Re, which is a reinsurance company, basically in January, I guess it was of 2019, they said that they were estimating about $16 billion in costs for recovery from Paradise when all was said and done. And when I think about $16 billion, like I think about what could you do with that $16 billion? And so, here's a couple things that you could do with that $16 billion. About the same time the Munich Re estimate came out, a business group in San Francisco came out with a report that said you could solve the entire homelessness crisis in the Bay Area for $16 billion. Back of the envelope, you could buy every household in Paradise a home for $6.5 billion. So like you could save $10 billion. You could send 64,000 kids to school through college for this amount of money. Or you could place solar panels on, 1.1 million homes. And so my point here is that there are trade-offs that are going to have to be made, and there are equity issues that are embedded in nearly everything you do. And the equity issue here is that that California's housing market has amplified so far beyond a retiree's ability to leave a place like Paradise and move back into a place where we could actually, as a society, provide a safe environment for. We can't continue to build in these areas, but this inequity is buried beneath a whole myriad of social constructs and contexts that you have to work within. So, if you think about urbanization more generally, like, come back out to this sort of bigger picture, what kind of cities are we thinking about when we start our work as academics or, as regional governments? And the question is, what kind of cities are we thinking about? Cities don't just appear, they form and grow through migration. And migration that's internal usually comes from people who are seeking opportunity or looking for ways to escape poverty. And this was the case with our retirees moving to Paradise. So, this big question of our time is, what kind of cities do we want today? And buried under that is the landscape of structural inequality and climate change. And you can't uncouple those. Those are going to be close together. So this brings me to my bigger question, which is, like, we hear slogans all the time, and which slogan you want to take on is interesting, right? Like, do we want smart cities? Do we want resilient cities? Do we want just sustainable cities? Do we want just sustainable cities? Do we want modern cities? I mean, like, we have these slogans that we hear over and over and over. And if you look deeply beneath these slogans, you realize that these slogans don't have much dimensionality to them. So let me give you a quick example. So smart cities, everybody thinks, that's technology oriented, especially engineers think smart cities are amazing, right? Like, what is it? I find myself saying, like, what the heck is a smart city anyway? Okay, so on the left, you see McKinsey, who says a smart city is a turning point in cities. It's going to solve all our problem by putting people in the center, right? And when I gave my Jakarta a lecture, people talked about smart cities, and I'm like, oh my God, you don't even have reliable electricity, right? So it's this juxtapositioning about smart cities as a panacea for getting us out of these problems that are very, they're very deeply entrenched. On the right, you see City Lab's discussion of smart cities, right? They're just pictures, and they're lots of hot air and marketing, and it's a way to generate data, a big, huge behavioral data farm that will, generate revenues for these firms down the road. I don't know what a smart city is, but I do know that how we do research emphasizes the unspoken. And that unspoken brings to bear many dimensions, often many more dimensions than we're actually concerned about. So let me give you the way I'm in the last few years, I'm returning to this idea about cities as systems concept. It's an old idea. It's been around for a really long time, but I found it increasingly useful for how I'm approaching, the big questions of our time, which are, for me, inequality and climate change. And how I use this diagram is to think about how the domains in my problem are connected to one another, and then to step back and think about the history, the kinds of identities, the way policies play with each other. I even go so far as to add dots to signify certain things about the intersections of these different domains. So I'm going to give you an example here, depending on the topic, and these dots represent regulation. So the first one is, if you have a dot for a regulation that doesn't land on a domain outline, it's just there in the middle, I call that red tape, right? For me, that's red tape. If you have a lot of dots at the cross sections of domains, I think of that as lots of red tape. And what I look for are single dots that intersect multiple domains. And then I break apart those domains for the question I'm working on and try and figure out how I can broaden my research perspective. And, I'm working on this study right now on crime and the computer science image, the AI approach to crime rates. And I'm working with the computer scientists, and we realize there's a dimension of historical sort of reflection that has to go on. So we've added a historian to the team. But I would have only gotten to that point by looking at how these domains overlap, tapping down those points to reflect different kinds of topics, and then saying, what do I need to know to work at this intersection and to make a difference? And, I personally am not going to be able to solve the entire problem, but of inequality or climate change. But at this level, this micro level, I might be able to make a difference. So I'm going to run through really quick examples where this has been very, very effective. And people have done this without even meaning to do it. So I'm sure you guys have heard about the Medellin cars, cable cars going up and down. So this is nestled in a valley high in the Andes, and the poorest residents live in these cumanas that are built on the steep slopes of the Andes. And during the 90s, there were lots of drug gangs, guerrilla fighters, all kinds of, very serious crime stuff going on. And lots of violence they controlled all the streets. And when the violence started waning a little, people began to come out. But getting out of these neighborhoods down into the city was a very big problem. And so what the mayor did was put up a cable car as a mobility solution, but it ended up being a solution that better connected the city itself. It brought people who were poor down into the city, and it brought people who had lived in the city up into the poor areas. And it began creating a more interwoven fabric for the city, and people became invested in the plight and the fate of these neighborhoods. And this wasn't the only thing that happened at this time. The Public Works Department created these sort of outdoor libraries that had parks. They took down old schools, they put up curbs. It was, you know, in the 10 years in the like mid 90s to the mid 2000s, it was remarkable the kinds of things that sort of took place there to cross over the dimension of transportation and poverty and community and context to weave things together. Here's another one. This is another example. Anybody who goes to Nairobi gets around in these buses, and these are called Matatus. And they're cheap and they're plentiful. They have really loud music. And in some of them, there's these sparkly disco balls going around. And the youth of Nairobi actually run these buses. You buy a bus and you have a young person who drives you around. And if you see these Matatus, you really begin to understand Nairobi, because it's basically a city run by youth. And so it's been really hard to harness all this energy into something that people could actually use. Well, an interesting thing happened. A group of researchers called Digital Matatus came together. They gave the university students a task and said, ride the bus, use your smartphone, and track the routes and the stops. And then what happened was Digital Matatus released its subway-style map of the more than 100 routes for this informal bus system, and people started snatching up these route maps just right and left. But it gets even cooler. A few months ago, Nairobi's Matatus became the first informal transit system on the Google Map system. They moved to a global platform. And it shows how you can harness informal work, you can harness youth, we can harness transportation, we can, you know, it's just like this super great, nice story that crosses many dimensions. And then the last one I'll give you was just because in Indonesia, right? So in Indonesia, women carry the burden of unpaid work. It's like most women in the developing country, and then this is because of gender inequality. Poor Indonesians also have less access to hospital, and women are more likely to be poor and less likely to visit a hospital if they get sick. And during the pandemic, I should say probably more than half of Indonesia's poor population works in the informal sector, and this is comprised mostly of women. So anyway, what happened when COVID hit was that the schools in Indonesia were shut down, right? And this school shutdown disproportionately affected women. And this was true globally, but it was really true here. And so what the Indonesian government did was they came in, and their sole interest was in providing subsidies to families who had suddenly lost their ability to make money, to work. And so they came up with this really incredibly complicated disbursement policy that had a long application process, required approval letters at each stage. And at the end of the day, these researchers realized that women were not actually getting these dispersal funds, even though they constituted the greatest majority of informal workers out of work. And so what they did was they came up with this system in which they have women in the central of each village and outside, you know, on these islands and outside the village and districts. And these women form networks, and they network other women together to get these applications filled out. And this started maybe a week and a half ago as a way to kind of move around the cumbersome system of the government just saying we need to give people who used to be working money. In that case, it's like poverty, informal workers, gender, you know, and relief. disbursement. Okay, so where I got to end now. In all of these examples, what you see are some common attributes that accompany sort of good solutions. And these factors always seem to acknowledge identity. They always seem to be, you know, grounded in real research problems, and they produce solutions that are relevant to the lived experiences of people. And I see these over and over and over. I started this this list about 5 years ago, and it comes up over and over. And the very best projects, you're able to check off these factors, each one of them, every single time. So, and the projects that fail are always missing 2 or 3 of these. So, you know, this is sort of where I've landed in thinking about these problems and thinking about how best to deal with structural inequity and climate change. So I'm going to stop there because I'm like way past. So I'll stop and let you guys ask a few questions.
Okay. Thank you so much. That's very nice. It's inspiring. The figure is amazing, by the way, with the circles. I haven't.
Oh yeah.
That's a lovely one, and so that's yours, right?
Yeah. And I have ones from every single project I've done in the last 5 years, and I've gotten better and better at drawing them and trying to figure them out. And I have these metrics about what the radius represents and where the dots go, and dots are colored by money, by red tape, by, you know, different factors. So yeah. So anyway, this is just like, this is my on the street grounded sort of way to think about problems, so I don't get trapped in thinking just about evacuation information.
So I'm going to start with a question from Kimberly Salt. So she's asking about the informal transit. And we all suffer from how the public transit is being served. So she's asking, do you think informal transit has a greater potential to more accurately serve the needs of the population than the formal sector?
Yeah, I think it depends on where. I think it works out really good in Nairobi because it's less hindered by sort of things like insurance and things like you know, by formal bureaucratic systems. I think, you know, there was an informal transit system that was started in the San Joaquin Valley a few years ago, and they ran into some trouble around sort of insurance providing you know, providing coverage when you're actually transiting other people. And they also ran into some safety issues, and then they ran into some things like, how do you get the message out, who gets allowed to use the system versus who doesn't. So I think it's contextually driven where it can work.
Okay. The nature of your research, question comes from Jamie.
Let me see if I can see Jamie. Okay,
Jamie,
got Jamie.
Unmute and talk and say the question if you want.
Yeah, there's Jamie by me.
Than me reading it, and better. He's better articulate than me. He's a lawyer. He's a former lawyer, so he's still a lawyer.
I guess I'm still barred. No, I mean, I'm very curious about the sort of conception of your research as a broader multi-dimensional approach, and whether or not you see that replicated in the policy space where implementation actually has to be more multi-dimensional. Like, so understanding the intersections between these different things helps you explain the process, but do you see policymakers ever understanding that or grasping that, or
you know, it's funny. I just had lunch with someone who was a HUD appointee under Obama, and she was saying that, you know, at HUD at least, which is sort of the affordable housing agency in the U.S., there is this recognition that affordable housing is connected to sort of the cycle of poverty, and also it's connected to education, and it's connected to neighborhoods, and it's, so I think there is this sort of place-based, you know, thinking that is beginning to evolve. And once you start thinking about place and contextualizing place, then I think it moves you to these dimensions, because places are bigger than just houses on a corner. They're schools, and they're shopping, and they're food, and they're But there is, I will say that I think there is this sort of policy desert, you know, to steal a term from technology, where you do this great research and you find things that are really important, and we can't get it across a policy desert and into policymakers' hands in a way that they can actually use it. And so I think, you know, in answer to your question, I think there's this gap, and I think the public sector at least has been slow on the uptake on some of this.
Yeah, no, I tend to think of it from the perspective of a lawyer and operating in sort of jurisdictional silos and realizing that the institutions we created aren't designed to address, you know, sort of multifaceted problems that require an understanding of the intersectionality.
Yeah, I'm working with this lawyer right now, and what we're working on is community finance districts. And what these are property taxes a community can levy against parcels, and it can pay for infrastructure for the parcel. Well, as it turns out, as you might imagine, and that parcel, the person who buys that house on that parcel pays this tax for 30 years, right? To pay for infrastructure that the developer probably should have paid for in the beginning. And it's led to a lot of greenfield development. And so I think this working across to think about the legal right and the practical has really benefited the both of us. I've learned a lot about sort of the law around tax, and he's learned a lot about sort of the engineering infrastructure around infrastructure. So you're right. I mean, there is this, you know, this discontinuity between domains that is tough.
Yeah, thanks. I've got a lot more thoughts, but I'll let the student.
So Coley is asking about the grassroots change in smaller local situations can produce amazing results. Do you think these are replicable in large-scale projects like transport, project networks, light rail projects? How do like the local grassroots scale can intervene and impact big projects? So federal government comes in and they put the light rail or they put the highway.
Right. Yeah, you know, I think the era of big projects is slowly going away. If you look at the number of big projects that have been funded over years, they're slowly going away. And that's not to say there isn't a place for a light rail extension or something. You know, maybe there is, but I tend to believe in grassroots hyperlocal right now, because I think trying to think about taking regional change is really hard, but trying to think about how you can change contextually in smaller context that can then spread is easier for me to parcel out. So, and I do know that, you know, like anybody who follows, you know, public hearings for big infrastructure, there's a lot of fighting about it. And so that's driven by the neighborhood groups. So I think they can impact it. Whether they can stop it or start it, you know, that's, I think, context driven as well.
So I have a question about the fires, and the way you explained it is totally different from what the media was explaining it.
Oh, really? Yeah. No.
And what the president of the United States was saying.
That's probably, it might be. That might be true.
So it's thanking you for explaining it that well. So that's one comment that came. Costa's asking about Medellin. Costa, can you unmute and ask your question?
I'll have to allow. Yep. You should be.
Costa, I can hear you, or I could hear you.
No, that's Jamie.
Oh, Jamie, okay.
Like weighing that down. He has to unmute. Oh, he can't? I'll ask you a question. Okay. So the Medellin Metro cable itself was just part of a bigger urban renewal project and was arguably so successful because of that. If big projects are going away, how do we ensure that the small ones take the big picture into account?
Oh, but I think you're right. It was part of a bigger project, but it wasn't. It was part of a bigger effort. It wasn't a bigger project, although there were some other things put in, but it was part of a bigger effort. I think big efforts that tackle multi-sector problems at the same time are important. So I think you're absolutely right, and thank you for sort of bringing that distinction up. I think why it worked so well was because it wasn't just a transportation solution. There were other dimensions going on at the rest of it, at the same time. So thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Kenan, who's a former graduate from our program from McGill, I'll ask his last question. So when you say mega projects are going away, isn't this a better way in the future, or does this negate the ideology of mega cities or regions instead of concept of smaller cities?
Wait, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Can you unmute and ask your question if you can? Faster. 1 second.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah,
you're unmuted. I can see you. Hi.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be back here and listening to you. My question was really asking, I live in Toronto and the GTA and a lot of other regions in Canada are looking into the idea of having mega cities across Canada and the States. And these build on the idea of having cross-sectional interaction between cities, between Canada and the States, and having great mega transportation infrastructure being built for the next 30 years. So when you say big projects are going away, do you think that's in the process of happening in the next 30 years, or they already started happening?
So, you know why big projects happen? They happen because, I mean, I'm doing a gross generalization here, but I worked on an audit of the third lock of the Panama Canal. I worked on an audit of the Bay Bridge, the new Bay Bridge, which was like $11 billion by the time it was done. I've worked on a lot of mega projects. And what I'm talking about, Trans Bay in San Francisco, also a mega project. But what I'm talking about is these single hardened projects from which you cannot recover. If I put in a 15-lane freeway in the middle of Cincinnati, if Cincinnati goes away, that money's just dead, right? And those kinds of projects I think are going away. In terms of the mega city concept, it both terrifies me and excites me, right? So the excitement part is the agglomeration potential, right? Like lots of cross-cultural, lots of exciting things that could happen, the sort of, gathering of really great brains and intellect. The part that terrifies me is that often in megacities, you find the structural inequities grow larger, not smaller. So, and the success of megacities all depend on the viability of the infrastructure that fuels them. And often that's not there either. So, in answer to your question about like megacities, I mean, I think they're both really exciting and terrifying. And I think it all depends on like who's at the helm, right? And how they build the ship that gets you there.
Unfortunately, we have to stop. Students have another class to start, some of them.
Oh man, I'm having fun.
Seriously, we have to bring you back again at some point to McGill in person and chat with you. It's lovely to have you, Deb, and really amazing to talk with you and to get enlightened with your ideas and your thoughts, and how you're looking at things comprehensively is very interesting for all of us, and it's a learning experience. And
well, you're very kind. I
loved your figures, really. I'm going to sit down and look at it slowly, and I really enjoyed the talk, and I think it was like the best way to end this talk. And thank you so much for taking the time and preparing a talk like that, and listening to all the other talks, and bringing us to a great end to our seminar series. So really, thank you so much, Deb.
And thank you for letting me spend this hour with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And happy Thanksgiving. We'll see you.
Yeah. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye now.